Hi, I'm Charlotte, and in this video we're going to make some galaxy shoes. This is what my 7-year-old grandson asked me to do for his birthday. It's a pretty easy technique. I also painted him a galaxy t-shirt. It's an entirely different technique. That one could be used on these shoes as well if you want to check that out, or if you want to paint a shirt. A few things before we get started. All the supplies are listed down below in the description. I also show them in the video. Also, the video is at double the speed that I painted them. That gave enough time for me to give all the verbal instructions and you could see what I was doing. Okay, let's get started. For the Sharpies, I used black, pink, purple, light blue, and dark blue. Don't bother taping your shoes, it just falls off as you start adding the rubbing alcohol. One really important thing to note before you get started is make sure you're in a well-ventilated space. I wasn't at first. I was back in my studio with the door shut, and the rubbing alcohol started smelling very strong. And I read the bottle and realized it says to use in a well-ventilated space. And the Sharpies themselves have a strong smell. So do this out in a big open room or even potentially outside, especially if you're doing it with children. You need to make sure you have an open space. I ended up opening the window in my studio and turning on the ceiling fan. That was enough for me. Just be aware of that. It's dangerous to do this in a closed up small room. Okay, let's talk about the technique of adding the marker. If you've been watching, I'm kind of jumping all over the place. One thing I learned in the beginning was I was putting too much white space in between the Sharpie lines. I found it was best to do close together lines and overlap each color a little bit. So as you move from black to blue or to the purple, let a few of your lines overlap. It helps the colors bleed in a little bit. So right here at the beginning, you'll see I don't do that. I have too much white space in there. And as the rubbing alcohol was bleeding, it wasn't covering as much and I was having to go back in on top. And once it got too wet, it wasn't picking up the color off of the Sharpie. So the back of this one shoe wasn't as clear. I'm able to fix it as I go along. But as I went forward, I realized overlap the color, put it in a lot thicker, try not to leave very much white space at all in there. As for the color scheme, there's really no rhyme or reason. You need to have the patches of black because obviously you're going for the galaxy outer space look. But for the rest of the colors though, it can be kind of random. Once I moved to the front of the shoe, I got a little fancier and kind of put in some spokes and swirls. For the backs and the sides of the shoes, the area is so small, you can truly be random about it. Make your black patches and then just fill in between, grabbing the different markers and having the spots. You'll see as the colors mesh together, it gives that nice swirly galaxy look to it. Be careful as you take your marker around to the edges of like the top where the leather is or down at the bottom where the leather is. You can clean it up some, but it's easier just to be a little bit careful as you go in there and not have to clean it up later. So now you have the basic idea of how to put down the color and the alcohol. You'll see throughout this video, I will put down color, then add the alcohol, and I was going back and forth kind of checking the techniques. But on the second shoe, I ended up doing much larger patches and doing the alcohol less and less throughout the shoe because I kind of got the hang of it. So at this point, just start coloring. You can even wait and do all the alcohol at the end if you like. But I was too impatient. I wanted to see how it was blending. And definitely saturate the shoe with the rubbing alcohol. I had a spray bottle that I was also spraying on it. It just wasn't getting it wet enough. What worked best for me was cotton balls dipped in it, and then I would literally squeeze out the cotton ball onto the shoe so it would get just color everywhere. My note about it getting too wet and not being able to color is because I left too much white space in there. If you find you've done that as well, you've left some patches you would like more color in, but the shoe is too wet, just wait for it to dry a bit. And then you'll be able to go in and add some marker and a little more alcohol for it to bleed in. And the alcohol dries fairly fast. It evaporates, so it doesn't stay wet very long. You will be getting the shoe wet enough with rubbing alcohol that the color does bleed to the inside of the shoe. That's okay. Foot's going to be in there anyway. Nobody will notice. This particular shoe has that elastic in it, so you can slide your foot in and out. I didn't really color that. I just let the rubbing alcohol bleed into it and kind of dabbed it. And that seemed to give it enough color and look kind of interesting. As I moved to the top of the shoe, I made my patches much larger. And I made sure I had a good light area on top to really highlight that galaxy feel. Again, really saturate the fabric with rubbing alcohol. Squeeze it in there because that really helps the colors bleed into each other. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the tape is completely pointless. The rubbing alcohol takes away the stickiness of the tape and it was falling off. So I just found it was easy to just clean off where it leaked down with clean cotton ball on rubbing alcohol and then wipe it dry. So here's the first shoe. As it dries, the colors will continue to bleed into each other. Let it dry for a while and then see if there's areas you want to touch up. I didn't like the transition between the light blue and the dark blue here. I used some purple to help that transition go a little bit smoother. I also felt like there wasn't enough of that light blue, so went in back on top. Once rubbing alcohol dries, it's easy to go back on top and add more Sharpie. This isn't like paint where it's building up layers. It's just ink that's being seeped into the fabric. So if there's spots you don't like, add a little bit more, add some more rubbing alcohol, wait for it to dry, and see how you like it. Don't stress too much though about certain lines or it not being perfect, because once we add stars on top, it covers a lot of that and actually becomes a really neat effect behind the stars. When I started on this second shoe, I had a lot more confidence after watching how the Sharpie and the rubbing alcohol interacted. So I am doing bigger patches, I'm coloring darker, and you notice I'm coloring right on top of the black with the blue. I felt the transition between colors was a lot smoother doing it this way. You'll also notice I'm not using the rubbing alcohol as frequently as I did on the first shoe. I already have an understanding of how this all works and blends in, so I'm going to do a lot larger patches before I pick up the rubbing alcohol, because it is a problem. Once the shoe gets wet, it won't take the ink from the Sharpie as well. So the longer you can go, the more Sharpie ink you'll be able to add on a first pass instead of waiting for things to dry and coming in on top of it. And since it's in my sight and I can't leave things alone, I've got to reach over here and add a little bit more marker to this shoe. And be sure to clean up any drips pretty quickly after you notice them, because as the alcohol dries, it's not as easy to clean up the Sharpie. So the first half of the side and the back of the shoe are done, so now I'm going to work to the next side. I approach coloring this shoe in that way, where I had the one side to the back and then the other side from the back to the front, and then left the top as the last part to do together. I do overlap in the back area though to make sure that the transition between the colors is seamless. Again, be careful as you're coloring next to the top rubber piece or the bottom rubber piece of the shoe. You can wipe it off to some degree, but sometimes it leaves a little bit of staining, so it's easier just to try and avoid it in the first place. And I did not try to copy the first shoe in any way, shape, or form. I didn't look at how I did the first shoe at all. I just picked up the markers randomly. I knew I needed to have plenty of black patches, but the other markers, it was just whichever one I felt like picking up. I think this technique is too loose to try and make two exact copies. I think you'd make yourself crazy if you're trying to get the shoes to be identical. Also, you've probably already figured this out from doing the first shoe, but the Sharpies do stay in your hands. If that really bothers you, you can wear a pair of gloves while doing this. It doesn't bother me at all. I've always got gardening dirt under my fingernails or paint on my hands or Sharpie stains. So I didn't worry about gloves, and I just wash my hands between each time, and it wears off after about a day. But if that's a problem, you definitely want to wear gloves while doing this project. Another note on the Sharpie strokes. With the first shoe, I was trying to be a lot more careful and be consistent, and I found that it looked better if I was more random with it. Like instead of doing all horizontal lines or vertical lines, you can see on this shoe, I go back and forth. I go up and down in the same color or blending the colors. I felt like it made it a little more of that random galaxy look by doing that. Like I said on the first shoe, I'm not coloring that bit of elastic. When I put down the rubbing alcohol, I just dot on top of it. It gets enough of the ink and then it bleeds in a little bit that it's enough of color. For me, you can color it if you want. You can see what I mean on this side of the shoe with this elastic. I didn't wet that with the rubbing alcohol, but with the shoe already being wet, it bleeds into it. So for me, it gave it enough color. As I mentioned before, these are for my 7-year-old grandson, so they're a kid-size shoe. But even with that, that gives the top of the shoe a nice big area that if you want to get a little bit fancy with kind of a design, you've got room to do it. Unlike the sides and the back where you're just kind of putting down color, it's hard to do any sort of pattern or design. But the front you can. I did kind of a swirl here. It's a little bit hard to see in the coloring, but it's what I had in mind. So I brought the blue up to the top and bringing it all the way around. And as I continue to color and add, I'm moving in a counterclockwise direction around the front of the shoe in kind of a curving motion. Because like I said, I wanted a little bit of a swirl effect in here. Think of like a black hole swirling or something. And you notice, even though it looks like I'm leaving white space in between the coloring, like I said, not to do, when I go back with the second color, I'm coloring on top of that. It's like I color right on top of this blue here, and I had covered before on top of the black with the previous blue. And I found that blending the colors on top of each other really helps the colors blend nicely. And this light blue was the center of that swirl I was trying to create. And again, overlap it on top of the purple, filling in the white spaces in the purple with it. And you'll see with that, adding the alcohol, it blends really nicely. It gives it a really neat effect. I really like the top of this shoe. And let's remove this completely pointless tape. Again, do not waste your time. It did nothing because I have to go in and clean it up anyway. I think I would have probably been a little bit more careful without it. I'd have been more careful getting up to the edge. You could almost even not color down to the edge because the alcohol will seep into the fabric and pull the color down anyway. So you can do a lot better job around the edges than I did without taping. So the key tips for creating your shoes are: don't leave a lot of white space, overlap your marker lines, and go heavy with rubbing alcohol. And please do this in a well-ventilated area. Now set them aside and wait until they're completely dry. I actually let them dry overnight. So after they're dry, we're ready to paint. The supplies I used to paint the stars were a glow-in-the-dark paint, a fabric medium, some sort of palette or even a little cup to mix the paint up in, a stiff brush or an old toothbrush to help do flicks, and then I just used a cotton swab. And if you notice on one end of it, I pulled the cotton off so that way I could do two different sizes, a smaller one with the cottonless end and a larger dot with the cottoned end. So the ratio of the fabric medium I was using is 2 parts paint to 1 part medium, and mix really well using a cotton swab or a paintbrush. You actually see me mixing this on top of the t-shirt, which is a separate video, and I painted them on the same day and used the same paint for both. So that's what you're seeing here. For my grandson's shoes, I did a pattern with the dots that corresponded to star signs or astrological signs. I didn't do the connecting lines to show the constellation because I wanted this to be kind of subtle. But you can truly do any random pattern of dots, and I used the smaller side of the cotton swab, the end I had pulled the cotton off of, for smaller dots or stars, and then I used the larger side, or the side with the cotton swab left on it, to do larger stars. I did my grandson's astrological sign on one shoe and then my daughter's on the other shoe. I'll let you see if you can figure out what they are. Like I said, I wanted this really subtle. Did you figure it out? Okay, I'll tell you. Now is when you need your old toothbrush or stiff brush, because we're going to rub our thumb across it and create splatters for the random stars and solar systems that you see in space and galaxy pictures. And do this all over the shoe. Don't worry about making a mess. You can wipe that off after you're done. After I let this dry, I did not like how faded that glow-in-dark paint looked on here. So I mixed up another batch with 1 part glow paint, 1 part white paint, and 1 part fabric medium. Remember, it's 2 to 1 on the paint versus medium. So having equal amounts of the glow paint and the white paint created that 2-part ratio. Then mix it up really well, and we're going to add more flicks and random stars with this mixture. This is completely optional, but I learned when I was doing his t-shirt, which I painted the stars before I did the shoes, that the white paint added into the mixture just made it a lot more vivid. It still keeps that glow-in-the-dark aspect, but when the shoes are out of the dark and the normal like this, having the white paint mixed in just made the stars brighter and made that contrast between the stars and the colored background more striking. As long as whatever brush or toothbrush you're using is putting in the tiny little flicks like this, go very heavy on it. Because if you look at a picture of a galaxy, there are just millions and billions of stars. So the more you put on the shoe, the more it looks like a galaxy. And remember my glove warning for the Sharpies? You may want to use a glove if you don't like getting paint all over your fingers. Fortunately, the paint washes off very easily, unlike the staining of the Sharpies. And then just use a damp paper towel to wipe off anything you got along the rubber. It comes off very easily as long as you do it right when you're doing it and don't let it dry first. And there you have the coolest pair of Galaxy shoes. They made my 7-year-old grandson very happy, and even my husband says he thinks he might want a pair of them. And my adorable grandson asked me to give a shout out to him and his YouTube channel. He is Grayson Gamer, showing you all about online gaming. I also painted him a Galaxy t-shirt. I used an entirely different technique for this, so I created a separate video. So you'll see it pop up on the right if you want to watch that. And if you like doing creative projects like this, then check out what else I have on my channel. And please subscribe for updates. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.